Long before the first verse of Genesis was ever spoken, long before a Hebrew scribe dipped his reed into ink to write the words, "In the beginning," those words had already been written. Not in Hebrew, not on parchment, but in wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay by the hands of a civilization so old that even the ancient Egyptians would have considered them ancient. The Sumerians, a people who appeared in the flatlands of southern Iraq sometime around 4500 BC, and who, without any apparent predecessor, without any slow crawl from primitive to sophisticated, built one of the most advanced civilizations the world had ever seen. And among the tens of thousands of clay tablets they left behind, buried for millennia beneath the dust of collapsed temples and forgotten cities, there is a story. A story about how humanity came to exist. A story that reads in places so remarkably similar to the book of Genesis that the resemblance cannot be coincidence. Except this story was written at least 1,000 years before Genesis, in some versions 2,000 years before. Tonight, we are going to read that story. Not the version you were taught, not the simplified, sanitized retelling that appears in modern textbooks. We are going to go back to the original clay, to the actual tablets, to the words that Mesopotamian scribes carefully pressed into the earth with the intention of preserving something they believed was too important to ever forget. And what those tablets describe is not a single god creating the world in 6 days. It is a council of beings, a pantheon of powerful entities called the Anunnaki, who after a long and bitter dispute among themselves, decided to solve a labor crisis by creating a new species. Us. The question that will follow us through the entire night is not whether the Sumerians told this story. They did. The evidence is sitting in museums around the world, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Baghdad, in Philadelphia. The question is something far more unsettling. If the Sumerian version came first, and if Genesis came after, then what exactly is Genesis? Is it divine revelation? Or is it a retelling, a reinterpretation, a theological reimagining of a much older narrative that originated not in the deserts of Canaan, but in the marshlands of ancient Iraq? That is the thread we will follow tonight. And by the time we reach the end, you may find that everything you thought you knew about the origin of humanity needs to be reconsidered. The story begins, oddly enough, not in ancient Mesopotamia, but in Victorian England. In November of 1872, a young man named George Smith sat hunched over a fragment of clay in the back rooms of the British Museum. Smith was not an archaeologist. He was not a professor. He was a self-taught Assyriologist, a former banknote engraver who had taught himself to read cuneiform script in his spare time. The museum had hired him to help catalogue the thousands of tablets that had been shipped from the ruins of Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, by the explorer Austin Henry Layard decades earlier. Most of the tablets were administrative records, tax receipts, inventories of grain and livestock. But on this particular November afternoon, Smith picked up a fragment from a larger tablet and began to read. The text described a man who had been warned by a god about an impending flood. This man had been told to build a boat, to seal it with pitch, to bring aboard his family and animals. The rains came. The world was submerged. After the waters receded, the man released a dove, then a swallow, then a raven to search for dry land. Smith recognized what he was reading. It was the story of Noah. Except it was not the story of Noah, It was written in Akkadian, a language that predated Hebrew by centuries. It was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the flood hero's name was not Noah, but Utnapishtim. And the tablet had been written at least 1,000 years before the earliest possible date for the composition of Genesis. According to the accounts that survive, Smith became so excited that he stood up, began pacing the room, and started removing articles of clothing. The other researchers in the room stared. Smith did not care. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in that moment, what he had just found. He had discovered that one of the most sacred stories in Western civilization, the story of the Great Flood, existed in an older form, written by a culture that the Bible never mentions by name. When Smith presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology on December 3, 1872, the audience included the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone. The reaction was electric. The Daily Telegraph newspaper immediately offered funding for Smith to travel to Nineveh and search for the missing fragments of the tablet. He went, and incredibly, against all odds, he found them. But the flood story was only the beginning. As more tablets were translated over the following decades, scholars realized that the Gilgamesh flood narrative was itself based on an even older text, the Atrahasis epic, which had been composed around 1700 BC. And embedded within the Atrahasis was not just a flood story, but a creation story, a detailed, elaborate, almost clinical account of how and why the gods created the first human beings, an account that predated Genesis by at least a millennium. This was the moment when the comfortable chronology of Western civilization began to crack. Because if the oldest creation story in the world was not Genesis, then everything built on the assumption that Genesis was the original account needed to be re-examined. And the more tablets that were found, the more translations that were completed, the wider that crack became. To understand how the Sumerians described the creation of humanity, we first need to understand how they imagined the world before humans existed. Because in the Sumerian worldview, the universe did not begin empty and void. It began full of gods. The Atrahasis epic, our oldest and most complete Mesopotamian creation narrative, opens with a line that sets the stage for everything that follows. When the gods were man, they did forced labor, they bore drudgery. In other words, before humanity existed, the gods themselves had to do the work of maintaining the world. They had to dig the canals, irrigate the fields, dredge the riverbeds, tend the crops, and they did not enjoy it. The cosmos, according to the Sumerian understanding, had already been organized. The three great realms had been divided among three great powers. Anu, the father of the gods, had taken the sky, the heavens above. He was remote, distant, rarely intervening directly in the affairs of the world below. Enlil, the most powerful of the active gods, had taken the earth and the atmosphere. He was the lord of the wind, the storms, the authority that governed civilization. And Enki, the cleverest of the three, had taken the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the surface of the earth, feeding the rivers and the springs. This division was not peaceful. It was the result of casting lots, a drawing of fates, and it meant that the lesser gods, the Igigi, were assigned the physical labor that kept the world functioning. They dug the Tigris, they dug the Euphrates, They maintained the irrigation channels that made agriculture possible in the arid plains of Mesopotamia. They did this for what the texts describe as an enormously long period, numbers that vary between versions, but often span thousands of years. And eventually, the Igigi broke. The tablets describe their exhaustion in surprisingly human terms. They grumbled, they complained, they grew bitter, their muscles ached, their spirits collapsed under the weight of endless, thankless toil. The text of the Atrahasis describes this moment with remarkable empathy. These were not abstract celestial beings suffering in silence. They were laborers, workers, pushed beyond their limits by a system that demanded everything and offered nothing in return. Then they did something extraordinary. They rebelled. The Igigi set fire to their tools. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil in the dead of night. They refused to work. Enlil was furious. His first instinct was punishment, perhaps even the total elimination of the rebellious gods. But the assembly of the great gods recognized something important. The complaint was legitimate. The workload was unsustainable. Something had to change. It was in this moment of crisis that Enki, the god of wisdom, the god of water, the god of craftsmanship, proposed a solution that would alter the course of existence itself. Instead of forcing the Igigi back to work, instead of creating more gods, instead of any number of divine solutions, Enki suggested something unprecedented. Create a new being, a hybrid, something made from the earth itself, but animated by divine essence, something strong enough to do the labor, intelligent enough to follow instructions, but not so powerful that it could threaten the gods. Create a worker, create a servant, create humanity. The gods agreed. And this, according to the oldest written records in human existence, is why we are here. Not because a loving creator looked upon an empty world and wished to fill it with life. Not because a singular god breathed into dust and gave it a soul out of generosity. But because the gods were tired, because they needed someone else to do the digging. There is something both humbling and oddly familiar about this origin. Every civilization that has ever existed has had a laboring class, a group of people whose work sustains the comfort of those above them. The Sumerians looked at their own society, at the vast army of workers who maintained the canals and the fields and the temples, and they projected that structure backward in time, all the way to the beginning. We were made, the tablets say, to carry the burden of the gods. The creation itself, as described in the Atrahasis and related texts, is not a mystical event shrouded in poetic vagueness. It is almost procedural. It reads less like a psalm and more like a set of instructions. The Sumerians did not describe the creation of humanity as an act of inspiration. They described it as a project, an engineering challenge with specific materials, specific steps, and specific participants. The key figures in this process were Enki, the god of wisdom and freshwater, and Nintu, also known as Ninhursag, or Mami, the mother goddess, the womb goddess, the birth goddess. Enki was the designer, the mind behind the plan. Nintu was the builder, the one who would actually shape the new creature into existence. The materials required were two. The first was clay, earth, the physical substance of the world itself. The Sumerians believed that the ground beneath their feet was the raw material from which all physical things could be formed. Clay was not merely dirt, it was potential. It was the medium through which the divine will could take shape. The second material was far more disturbing. It was the essence of a god. Specifically, the flesh and the life force of a deity who was to be sacrificed for this purpose. In the Atrahasis, the god chosen for sacrifice was a figure named Geshtu-e, sometimes rendered as We-ilu in later Akkadian versions, described as a god who had intelligence, a god whose very nature was wisdom and awareness. He was selected not randomly but deliberately. His intelligence, his consciousness, his capacity for thought, these qualities would be transferred into the new creation. The text states that the gods gathered in assembly and made their decision. Geshtu-e was brought forward, and then, in a ritual that the tablets describe with the weight of a solemn ceremony, he was offered. His essence was taken. His life force, which the Sumerians called his spirit or his ghost, was mixed with the clay. Nintu took the mixture, this combination of divine essence and earthly substance, and began to shape it. The texts describe her pinching off 14 pieces of clay, 7 placed to the right, 7 placed to the left. 7 would become male, 7 would become female. She shaped them carefully, molding each one, setting them in pairs. And she spoke the words that would bring them to life. Now pause here for a moment and consider what this means. The Sumerians believed that every human being carried within them a fragment of divine intelligence. We were not purely physical creatures. We were hybrids, mixtures of earth and heaven, of clay and godhood. The reason we could think, reason, dream, create, the reason we were different from the animals, was because a god had been dissolved into our making. We had, quite literally, a spark of the divine within us. This detail becomes profoundly significant when we compare it to Genesis. In Genesis 2:7, God forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. The mechanism is different, breath versus blood and flesh, but the underlying concept is identical. Humanity is a combination of earthly material and divine essence, the physical and the transcendent mixed together. The Sumerians wrote this concept down at least 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was composed. And while some scholars argue that the two traditions developed independently, the geographic and cultural connections between Mesopotamia and the ancient Hebrews make independent development unlikely. The Hebrews lived within the cultural orbit of Mesopotamia. Abraham himself, according to the Bible's own account, came from Ur, one of the great Sumerian cities. The idea that the Genesis creation account exists in a vacuum, untouched by the vast Mesopotamian literary tradition that surrounded it on all sides, requires a level of coincidence that strains credibility. One of the most striking differences between the Sumerian creation account and the Genesis narrative is the number of decision-makers involved. In Genesis, creation is the act of a single, sovereign God. Let there be light, and there was light. There is no debate, no committee, no disagreement. One voice speaks, and reality obeys. In the Sumerian account, creation is a collective decision. It emerges from what the tablets describe as a divine assembly, a council of gods who debate, argue, negotiate, and occasionally threaten one another before reaching a consensus. This is not a monarchy. It is something closer to a parliament, a governing body of powerful beings with competing interests and different levels of authority. The Anunnaki, the great gods who ruled the cosmos, functioned through this assembly. Decisions of cosmic importance, like the creation of humanity, required the approval of the council. Anu presided as the nominal head, but he rarely imposed his will unilaterally. Enlil held the most executive power on earth. Enki provided the intellectual framework, the plans, the solutions. And the other gods, dozens of them, had their own domains, their own interests, their own grievances. The creation of humanity was not a gentle, loving act. It was a compromise. The Igigi gods had rebelled. The great gods needed to restore order. Enlil wanted to punish the rebels. Enki offered an alternative. The assembly deliberated, and the decision was made, not unanimously, not without tension, but through the messy, imperfect process of collective governance. Now here is something remarkable. There is a verse in Genesis that has puzzled theologians for centuries. Genesis 1:26 reads, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Us, our. These are plural pronouns. In a text that is emphatically monotheistic, why would God speak in the plural? The traditional theological explanation is that this is a royal we, a majestic plural, or possibly an early hint of the Trinity. These are reasonable theological interpretations within the framework of Hebrew monotheism. But there is another possibility, one that becomes difficult to ignore once you have read the Sumerian tablets. The plural pronouns may be a fossil, a linguistic remnant of the older tradition in which creation was indeed a collective act by multiple gods. When the Hebrew scribes adapted the Mesopotamian creation narrative into their own theological framework, they condensed the pantheon into a single god. But this one verse, this "let us," may preserve the echo of the original council, the assembly of the Anunnaki, debating the creation of humanity, deciding together what form it would take. The Sumerians never hid the fact that their gods disagreed. The creation of humanity was not born from love or benevolence. It was born from exhaustion and political necessity. And the beings who made us were not united in their vision for what we should become. Enki wanted us to be intelligent, capable, perhaps even wise. Enlil wanted us to be obedient, controllable, useful. This tension between the god who championed humanity and the god who wished to limit us runs through every major Sumerian text like a red thread. It is the same tension that appears in Genesis, where God both creates humanity in his own image and then banishes humanity from Eden for daring to reach too far. The God of Genesis both loves and fears his creation. He grants knowledge and then punishes those who seek it. He creates life and then sends a flood to destroy it. These contradictions do not make sense within a purely monotheistic framework. But they make perfect sense if we remember that the original story involved multiple gods with different agendas: Enki and Enlil, creation and control, wisdom and obedience. The tension between them was not resolved in the Sumerian version, and it was not resolved in Genesis either. When Nintu finished shaping the 14 figures of clay, when the divine essence of the sacrificed god had been mixed into their forms, the first humans opened their eyes. They breathed, they moved, they looked around at the world that the gods had built and that they were now expected to maintain. The Atrahasis is unambiguous about their purpose. The humans were created to be Lulu, a Sumerian word that can be translated as mixed one or primitive worker. They were to take over the labor that the Igigi had refused to continue. They would dig the canals. They would tend the fields. They would build the temples. They would prepare the food offerings that the gods required. This last detail is crucial to understanding the Sumerian worldview. The gods needed to eat. They needed sustenance. and that sustenance came in the form of sacrificial offerings prepared by humans. Without humans to farm the land, harvest the grain, slaughter the animals, and burn the offerings on the temple altars, the gods would go hungry. This is not metaphor. The Sumerians genuinely believed that the smoke rising from their sacrificial fires nourished the divine beings who watched over them. This creates a relationship between humans and gods that is fundamentally different from the one described in Genesis. In Genesis, God is self-sufficient. He creates the world not because he needs anything, but because he chooses to. Humanity is the pinnacle of creation, made in God's image, given dominion over the earth. There is a warmth to the Genesis account, a sense that humanity is wanted, valued, cherished. In the Sumerian version, humanity is necessary. We are the infrastructure of the divine economy. We exist because the gods needed someone to do the work. We are valued not for our own sake, but for the function we serve. This is a much colder origin story. It is also arguably a more honest one, at least if honesty means reflecting the reality of the human condition as the Sumerians experienced it. Because for the vast majority of Sumerians, life was labor. The average person in ancient Mesopotamia worked from dawn to dusk, maintaining the canals, farming the fields, serving the temple, paying taxes in grain and labor to the priestly class that mediated between humans and gods. When a Sumerian looked at his own life and asked, "Why do I exist?" the answer provided by his culture was not comforting. You exist to work. You exist to serve. You exist because the gods needed hands that were not their own. And yet, there is that divine spark, that fragment of Geshtui, the god of intelligence, whose essence was woven into the clay. Even in a system that defined humans as servants, the Sumerians acknowledged that we carried something extraordinary within us. We could think, we could create, we could look up at the stars and wonder, we could write, we could, on our best days, rival the gods in our capacity for understanding. This duality, servant and divine, worker and thinker, clay and godhood, is perhaps the most profound insight of the Sumerian creation story. It captures something essential about what it means to be human. We are bound to the earth, to labor, to mortality. And yet we carry within us a light that seems to come from somewhere else entirely. The Sumerians had a word for this condition. They called it the burden and the blessing of being Lalu. The mixed one, part God, part dirt, reaching for heaven with feet stuck in clay. As we journey deeper into these ancient tablets, further back in time than most people ever dare to look, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Which corner of the world are you in right now? Are you somewhere in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa? Are you lying in the dark with your eyes closed, or watching the night sky through a window? Leave a comment below and tell me where you are. There is something extraordinary about knowing that people from every continent are connected right now by the same ancient story, a story that was first told in the marshlands of southern Iraq more than 4,000 years ago. If there is one dynamic that defines the entire Sumerian theological tradition, it is the rivalry between Enki and Enlil. These two gods represent opposing philosophies about the relationship between the divine and the human, and their conflict echoes through every major Mesopotamian text, including the creation narrative. Enlil was the god of authority, of storms, of the wind that carried both the gentle breeze and the devastating hurricane. He was the chief executive of the divine assembly on earth, the one who enforced the decrees of the council, the one who maintained cosmic order. He was not evil exactly. He was severe. He believed in boundaries, in hierarchies, in the absolute separation between gods and humans. Humans existed to serve. They should not rise above their station. They should not make too much noise, should not multiply without limits, should not presume to approach the divine. Enki was everything Enlil was not. He was the god of water, of wisdom, of craftsmanship, of mischief, of unexpected solutions. He was the one who designed humanity. He was the one who, again and again, throughout the Sumerian literary tradition, intervened to save humans from the consequences of Enlil's wrath. When Enlil sent plagues to reduce the human population, Enki taught the priest Atrahasis how to appease the gods and stop the disease. When Enlil sent drought and famine, Enki found ways to bring water and fish to the starving people. When Enlil finally decided to destroy all of humanity with a great flood, it was Enki who warned Atrahasis and told him to build a boat. Enki was humanity's advocate. He created us, and he never stopped defending us. He gave us intelligence, and he refused to let that intelligence be wasted. He broke divine oaths to protect us. He defied the will of the assembly to keep us alive. He was, in every meaningful sense, the God who loved humanity. Enlil was the God who feared us. Now consider this dynamic, and then read Genesis again. The God of Genesis creates humanity and places them in a garden. He tells them not to eat from the tree of knowledge. A serpent, associated in ancient Near Eastern iconography, with wisdom and with Enki specifically, tells the humans to eat. They eat, they gain knowledge, and God, rather than celebrating their growth, expels them from the garden and curses them. Later, the same God looks down at the world and sees that humanity has multiplied and become wicked. He decides to destroy them with a flood. But then he warns one righteous man, instructs him to build a boat, and saves a remnant of humanity from the destruction he himself ordained. In Genesis, one God does everything that in the Sumerian version is divided between two gods, the loving creator and the stern judge, the giver of knowledge and the punisher of knowledge, the flood sender and the flood survivor's protector. In the Sumerian original, these contradictions are explained by the fact that different gods had different agendas. In Genesis, they become paradoxes within a single divine personality. The consolidation is elegant. It transforms a polytheistic narrative into a monotheistic one. But the seams are still visible if you know where to look. And once you have read the Sumerian version, you cannot unread it. The shadow of Enki falls over every act of divine mercy in Genesis. The shadow of Enlil falls over every act of divine wrath. Among the Sumerian texts that have survived the millennia, there is a myth that describes a place called Dilmun. It is described as a land that is pure, clean, bright. A land where the lion does not harm, where the wolf does not seize the lamb, where sickness does not exist, where old age does not touch the residents. It is a paradise, a garden of the gods. The myth of Enki and Ninhursag, one of the oldest literary compositions in human history, tells what happened in this garden. Enki, ever curious, ever hungry for knowledge and experience, was placed in this paradise alongside Ninhursag, the mother goddess. The garden was filled with wondrous plants, each one possessing unique properties, and Enki, in his insatiable desire to understand everything, did the one thing he was not supposed to do. He ate the plants, 8 of them, one after another. He consumed the forbidden vegetation of the divine garden. Ninhursag was furious. She cursed Enki. She condemned him to suffer ailments in 8 parts of his body, 1 for each plant he had consumed. Enki fell ill. He weakened. He was on the verge of fading entirely. Eventually, Ninhursag relented. She created 8 healing deities, 1 for each of Enki's afflicted organs. And here is where the story delivers one of the most extraordinary linguistic connections in all of ancient literature. One of Enki's afflicted organs was his rib. In Sumerian, the word for rib is ti. Ninhursag created a goddess to heal Enki's rib, and she named this goddess Ninti, which means Lady of the Rib. But in Sumerian, the word tai also means to make live or life. So Ninti simultaneously means Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. Now consider Eve. In Genesis, Eve is created from Adam's rib, and Eve's name, Hawa in Hebrew, means mother of all living, which is to say, Lady of Life. The double meaning works in Sumerian, where a single word encompasses both rib and life. It does not work in Hebrew, where the words for rib and life are completely different. The bilingual pun only makes sense in the original language. This is not a coincidence. It is a fingerprint. It is evidence of direct literary inheritance, a moment where the Hebrew authors adapted a Sumerian narrative and carried over a wordplay that only fully functions in the source language. It is the kind of detail that academics spend entire careers analyzing, because it tells us something definitive about the relationship between these texts. The Garden of Dilmun is the Garden of Eden, not in a metaphorical sense, not in a vague, all cultures have paradise myths sense, in a specific, linguistic, traceable, demonstrable sense. The story of a divine being who eats forbidden plants in a sacred garden and suffers consequences, the creation of a figure associated with both a rib and the giving of life. These are not parallel developments. They are the same story, told first in Sumerian and then retold in Hebrew. And the implications of this are enormous. Because if the Garden of Eden is Dilmun, then the fall of man is not a uniquely biblical concept. It is a retelling of a much older narrative about the consequences of forbidden knowledge, about the price of curiosity, about the tension between obedience and understanding that has defined the human condition since the very first stories were told. There is another Sumerian figure whose shadow falls unmistakably across the pages of Genesis. His name is Adapa, and his story is one of the most tragic in all of ancient literature. Adapa was the first of the 7 Apkallu, the great sages who lived before the flood. He was the wisest of all humans, a priest of the temple of Enki in the city of Eridu, the oldest city in the world, according to Sumerian tradition. Enki had personally granted Adapa extraordinary wisdom, knowledge of the heavens and the earth, understanding of the sacred arts and sciences. But there was one thing Enki had not given him: immortality. The text, known as the myth of Adapa, tells what happened next. One day, while Adapa was fishing in the Persian Gulf to provide food for the temple, the south wind blew and capsized his boat. In his anger, Adapa cursed the south wind, and such was his power that the wind's wing was broken. It stopped blowing entirely. Anu, the god of the sky, noticed that the south wind had ceased. He summoned Adapa to heaven to account for what he had done. Before Adapa left for this divine audience, Enki gave him instructions. He told Adapa that when he arrived in heaven, 2 gods would guard the gate, Tammuz and Gishzida. They would offer Adapa food and water. Enki warned him, "You will be offered bread and water. Do not eat the bread. Do not drink the water. They are the bread and water of the end." Adapa obeyed his god. He traveled to the gate of heaven. Tammuz and Gishzida were there, exactly as Enki had described. They interceded on his behalf with Anu, who was so impressed by Adapa's wisdom that he decided to offer him something extraordinary. Anu ordered that Adapa be given the bread of life and the water of life, the sustenance that would make him immortal. But Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refused. He would not eat the bread. He would not drink the water. Anu was baffled. He asked why Adapa refused the gift. And in that moment, Adapa realized what had happened. Enki had deceived him. Enki had told him the bread and water were instruments of cessation, when in fact, they were the instruments of eternal life. By following his god's instructions, Adapa had lost immortality for himself and for all of humanity. The question that reverberates through this myth is, why? Why would Enki, who loved humanity, who created humanity, deliberately trick his most devoted servant into refusing immortality? The answer may lie in the fundamental structure of the Sumerian cosmos. The gods needed the boundary between divine and human to remain intact. If humans became immortal, they would become gods. And if they became gods, who would do the work? Who would tend the canals and the fields? Who would offer the sacrifices? The entire system depended on human mortality. Enki may have loved Adapa, but he loved the cosmic order more. Now read Genesis 3 again. Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge. They gain awareness, wisdom, understanding. And God's response is not merely to punish them. It is to expel them from the garden, specifically so that they cannot also eat from the tree of life and become immortal. The man has now become like one of us, God says, again using the plural, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. The fear is the same. The mechanism is the same. Humanity approaches immortality, and the divine intervenes to prevent it. In the Sumerian version, Enki uses deception. In Genesis, God uses expulsion, but the result is identical. Humanity is granted knowledge, but denied eternal life. We are allowed to become wise, but not allowed to become divine. Adapa is Adam, not in the sense that they are the same individual, but in the sense that they serve the same narrative function. They are the first humans, wise beyond their station, who come within reach of immortality and lose it. One through obedience to a trickster god, the other through disobedience to a jealous one. The irony is devastating. Adapa lost immortality by doing exactly what his god told him. Adam lost it by doing exactly what his god told him not to do. The outcome is the same. The lesson is the same. We are not meant to live forever. That privilege belongs to the gods alone. And the Sumerian version was written first. After the creation of humanity, the Atrahasis epic does not end. In many ways, it is only beginning, because the creation of humans solved the labor problem, but it created a new one. Humans did not simply work in silence. They lived, they loved, they multiplied, they built families and communities. They laughed and argued and celebrated and mourned. They made noise, and this noise bothered Enlil. The text describes Enlil's irritation in terms that are almost comical in their domesticity. He could not rest. The sound of humanity disturbed his peace. The world had become too loud, too crowded, too chaotic. Enlil, the god of order, the god of cosmic authority, lay in his divine chambers, unable to find silence. His solution was not subtle. He decided to reduce the human population. First, he sent plague. The texts describe a devastating illness that swept through the human settlements, reducing their numbers. But Enki intervened. He taught the priest Atrahasis to pray specifically to Namtar, the god of pestilence, to offer sacrifices directly to the source of the disease. The plague was lifted. Enlil tried again. He sent drought. He withheld the rains. The crops failed. Famine spread across the land. But again Enki found a way. He instructed Atrahasis to pray to Adad, the storm god, and to build a temple in his honor. The rains returned. Enlil tried a third time. He sent more drought, more famine, more suffering. The texts describe conditions of such extreme deprivation that, in the words of the ancient scribes, families were reduced to circumstances that the tablets describe with a gravity that suggests things we would today consider unthinkable. Even the soil itself turned hostile, refusing to yield its fruit. And through it all, Enki found ways to keep humanity alive. He sent fish from the depths. He bent the rules. He broke the spirit, if not the letter, of the divine decrees. He was, in the truest sense, humanity's guardian angel, a divine being who repeatedly chose compassion over compliance. Enlil's frustration with Enki is palpable in the texts. He accused Enki of undermining the will of the assembly. He accused him of favoring his creations over his fellow gods. He saw in Enki's protection of humanity a dangerous precedent, a sign that the servants might one day rival the masters. And so Enlil made his final decision, one that would not be undermined, one that would be absolute and irreversible. He would send a flood so vast, so total, so overwhelming, that no amount of clever prayers or redirected sacrifices could stop it. He would wipe humanity from the face of the earth and start over. And this time, he made the gods swear an oath. Every god, including Enki, was bound by this oath not to warn the humans of what was coming. The flood was coming, and the gods had sealed their promise of silence. Enki was bound by his oath. He could not speak directly to any human about the coming flood. The assembly had decreed it, the oath had been sworn, and even Enki, the cleverest of the gods, could not simply ignore a divine covenant. But Enki was not the god of wisdom for nothing. The Atrahasis describes what happened next with a scene so vivid, so charged with dramatic tension, that it has echoed through every flood narrative written since. Enki did not speak to Atrahasis. Instead, he spoke to a wall. Specifically, he spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house, knowing that Atrahasis was on the other side, listening. "Wall, listen to me," Enki said. "Reed wall, pay attention to all my words. Flee the house, build a boat, forsake possessions, and save life." This is one of the most ingenious moments in all of ancient literature. By addressing the wall rather than the man, Enki technically did not break his oath. He did not warn a human, he warned a wall. The fact that a human happened to be standing on the other side of that wall, hearing every word, was simply a coincidence, a fortunate accident, a loophole exploited by a god who had sworn to remain silent, but refused to let his creation perish. Atrahasis understood immediately. He gathered the elders of his community. He told them that he had received a message, that a catastrophe was coming, that he needed to build a boat. The text describes the construction in practical terms. the assembling of materials, the loading of provisions, the bringing aboard of his family and animals, and then, with a detail that brings the narrative to agonizing life, the tablets describe Atrahasis's emotional state as the storm approached. He could not sit still. He could not rest. His heart was broken. The ancient scribes chose a phrase that resonates across the millennia. He was overwhelmed with anguish, knowing that everything he had ever known was about to be swept away. The storm came. It raged for 7 days and 7 nights. The waters rose. The cities vanished. The fields, the canals, the temples, the ziggurats, everything that humanity had built was submerged beneath an endless, merciless sea. And on the 8th day, it stopped. The waters began to recede. Atrahasis opened a window of his boat and felt the air. He released birds, a dove, a swallow, a raven, to search for dry land. When the raven did not return, he knew the waters had found their level. He stepped out of the boat. He touched the mud. He breathed. And then he did the first thing any Sumerian would do upon surviving the impossible. He built an altar and prepared a sacrifice. The smoke rose into the sky, and the gods, who had been starving since the flood began because there were no humans to offer them food, smelled the sweet aroma and gathered around the offering. The tablets describe them converging like flies around the sacrifice, desperate, hungry, humbled by the realization that in destroying humanity, they had nearly destroyed themselves. Enlil arrived last, and when he saw Atrahasis, when he saw that a human had survived the flood that was supposed to eliminate all humans, his rage was immediate and total. No living being was supposed to survive the destruction, he roared. He looked at the other gods, demanding to know who had betrayed the oath. All eyes turned to Enki, and Enki, standing before the assembly, before the wrathful Enlil, before the entire divine council that had sworn him to silence, spoke the words that define his character across all of Sumerian literature. "I did not break my oath," he said. "I warned no human. I spoke to a wall." The assembly fell silent. Even Enlil could not argue with the logic. The oath had been kept, technically. And the result was that humanity survived. A remnant, a family, a handful of people carrying the memory and the knowledge of everything that had come before. But the survival came with a cost. A negotiation followed between Enlil and Enki, the details of which the tablets only partially preserve. The gods agreed that humanity would continue to exist, but with limitations. There would be sickness, infertility, certain classes of people who could not bear offspring. The human lifespan, once described in the Sumerian king list as spanning tens of thousands of years for the antediluvian rulers, would be drastically shortened. Humanity would endure, but it would endure diminished, mortal, fragile, bound to the earth by the weight of its own flesh. And this, according to the Sumerians, is why we grow old. This is why we get sick. This is why we cannot live forever. Not because we are sinful, not because we disobeyed a command in a garden, but because the gods, after nearly extinguishing us entirely, decided to let us live on a shorter leash. Before the Atrahasis, before the Enuma Elish, before even the Gilgamesh flood tablet that made George Smith lose his composure in the British Museum, there was an even older text. It is called the Eridu Genesis, and it is the oldest creation and flood narrative ever discovered. The Eridu Genesis survives in fragments. The primary tablet was excavated from the ruins of Nippur, one of the holiest cities in all of Sumer, by an expedition from the University of Pennsylvania in 1893. It sat unread for nearly 2 decades until the Sumerologist Arno Pobel recognized its significance in 1912. Written in Sumerian, not Akkadian, and dating to approximately 1600 BC, this text preserves traditions that are even older than the composition date suggests. Traditions that reach back to the very beginnings of Sumerian civilization. The tablet is badly damaged. Much of the text is missing, and what remains is fragmented, requiring careful reconstruction. But what we can read is extraordinary. The narrative begins with a goddess, Nintur, calling humanity from a wandering, nomadic existence to settle down, to build cities, to establish temples. She envisions an ordered world in which humans live in communities, raise livestock, practice agriculture, and worship the gods who created them. The text then names the first cities of civilization: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shuruppak. Each is placed under the protection of a specific deity. Each represents a step in the development of organized society. This is not a mythical creation from nothing. This is a description of the transition from a wandering, pre-urban existence to the settled, city-based civilization that the Sumerians considered the hallmark of true humanity. After a significant gap in the text, the narrative arrives at the familiar territory of the flood. Enlil, disturbed by the noise of the growing human population, decides to send a deluge. Enki, defying the will of the assembly, warns a man named Ziusudra. In the Eridu Genesis, this is the flood hero's name, not Atrahasis, not Utnapishtim, not Noah. Ziusudra, a name that means life of long days in Sumerian. Ziusudra is described as a pious king, a devoted servant of the gods. He receives the warning, though the exact mechanism is lost in the damaged portions of the tablet. He survives the flood, which rages for 7 days and 7 nights. When the storm subsides and the sun reappears, Ziusudra opens a window of his vessel and prostrates himself before the sun god Utu. He offers sacrifices, and then, in gratitude for his devotion and his survival, the gods Anu and Enlil grant Ziusudra something extraordinary: breath eternal, eternal life. He is transported to Dilmun, the paradise land, where he will live forever. This detail is crucial. In the oldest version of the flood story, the survivor is given immortality. He is removed from the mortal world and placed in paradise. He becomes, in effect, a bridge between the human and the divine, a mortal who transcended his condition through piety and obedience. This motif survives in the later versions. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero finally finds Utnapishtim, the flood survivor is living in a distant, inaccessible paradise beyond the waters of the end of the world. He has become immortal. He is the only human who has ever achieved what every human desires. And in Genesis, Noah does not receive immortality. He lives 950 years, an extraordinary span by later standards, but he does eventually pass. The Hebrew authors, committed to the principle that immortality belongs to God alone, stripped this element from the narrative. The flood survivor could be righteous. He could be saved. He could even live an extraordinarily long time. But he could not become divine. That line in the Hebrew theological framework could never be crossed. The Eridu Genesis is a fragmentary whisper from the oldest age of writing. But within its broken lines, we can hear the outlines of a story that would be retold for thousands of years, each retelling shifting the emphasis, altering the theology, adjusting the message to fit the worldview of its tellers. The Sumerians told it first. The Babylonians elaborated it. The Hebrews transformed it. And we, inheritors of all three traditions, are still listening. There is one more parallel between the Mesopotamian tradition and Genesis that deserves our attention, because it connects directly to the most visible architectural achievement of Sumerian civilization, the ziggurat. Genesis 11 tells the story of the Tower of Babel. Humanity, united by a single language, decides to build a city with a tower that reaches the heavens. God sees this project and is alarmed. If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, he says, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So God confuses their language, scatters them across the earth, and the tower is abandoned. The Hebrew word Babel is explicitly connected to Babylon in the text, and the tower itself is unmistakably a ziggurat. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were stepped pyramids, each level smaller than the one below, rising toward the sky in a series of terraces. The most famous was the Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon, dedicated to the god Marduk. Its name means house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was meant to be a bridge, a connection point between the human world and the divine. The Etemenanki was a real structure. Archaeological evidence confirms its existence, and ancient texts describe it as having 7 levels, each painted a different color, representing the known celestial bodies. It was enormous by ancient standards, and it dominated the skyline of Babylon for centuries. The Hebrew authors, writing during or shortly after the Babylonian exile, would have seen this structure. They would have known its significance, and they would have understood the theology behind it. The Babylonians believed that by building high enough, by creating a physical stairway to the sky, humans could approach the divine realm. The Genesis response is a rejection of this theology. The tower is not a bridge to heaven. It is an act of hubris. God does not welcome humanity's approach. He scatters it. The lesson is clear. The boundary between human and divine is not something that can be crossed by engineering. It is maintained by God himself, and any attempt to breach it will be met with confusion and dispersion. But consider this from the Sumerian perspective. The ziggurats were not acts of rebellion against the gods. They were acts of devotion. They were built at divine command to honor the gods, to provide them with earthly residences, to maintain the connection between heaven and earth that was essential for the proper functioning of the cosmos. The Sumerians did not see their towers as challenges to divine authority. They saw them as expressions of it. The Genesis narrative takes this Mesopotamian institution, the ziggurat, and reinterprets it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching. The building that the Sumerians considered sacred, the Hebrews considered sinful. The bridge that the Babylonians celebrated, the biblical authors condemned. This is the pattern we have seen throughout our journey tonight. The Hebrew scribes did not merely borrow Mesopotamian stories. They argued with them. They took the raw material of Sumerian and Babylonian mythology and reshaped it to serve a fundamentally different theological vision. Where the Mesopotamians saw gods who needed humans, the Hebrews saw a God who chose humans. Where the Mesopotamians saw a cosmos governed by compromise and conflict, the Hebrews saw a cosmos governed by a single, purposeful will. Where the Mesopotamians built towers to reach the gods, the Hebrews taught that God would come down to meet his people on his own terms. The argument is magnificent, but it is an argument, and every argument implies a prior claim that it seeks to refute. The prior claim was Sumerian. It was written in cuneiform. It was pressed into clay thousands of years before Genesis was composed, and it is still legible today for anyone with the patience and the courage to read what was written before the beginning. Everything we have just described, the flood, the boat, the warning, the birds, the sacrifice, the gathering of the hungry gods around the smoke, all of this was written in cuneiform on clay tablets at least 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was composed. And the parallels between the two accounts are not vague thematic similarities. They are specific, sequential, and structural. In the Atrahasis, humanity becomes too numerous and too loud. In Genesis, humanity becomes wicked, and God regrets having made them. In both versions, the divine decision is made to destroy humanity with a flood. In both versions, one righteous man is warned and told to build a boat. In both versions, the man brings his family and animals aboard. In both versions, the flood lasts for a specific number of days. In both versions, the man releases birds to test whether the waters have receded. In both versions, the man offers a sacrifice after the flood, and the divine being or beings respond to the sweet smell of the offering. And in both versions, the divine authority promises never to send such a flood again. These are not parallel myths that developed independently. The narrative architecture is identical. The sequence of events is identical. Specific details, like the birds, like the smell of the sacrifice, are replicated with such fidelity that the conclusion is inescapable. The Genesis flood narrative was adapted from the Mesopotamian original. When George Smith stood in the British Museum in 1872 and began reading the Gilgamesh flood tablet, he was looking at evidence that what he and every other person in the Victorian Christian world had assumed was a uniquely biblical story was, in fact, a retelling. The original belonged to the Sumerians and their Akkadian and Babylonian successors. The Hebrew version was a descendant, not an ancestor. The Sumerian king list reinforces this understanding. This remarkable document, which survives in multiple copies, lists the rulers of Sumerian cities from the earliest times down to the historical period. It is divided into two sections, before the flood and after the flood. The antediluvian kings ruled for impossibly long periods, with some reigns spanning tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns shortened dramatically, from tens of thousands to hundreds, and then to historically plausible figures. Genesis follows an identical structure. The patriarchs before the flood, Adam, Methuselah, Noah, live for hundreds of years. After the flood, lifespans decrease rapidly. Abraham lives to 175. Moses lives to 120. By the time of David, the human lifespan has settled to approximately its modern range. The pattern is the same. The direction is the same. The flood serves as the dividing line in both traditions, separating an era of extraordinary longevity from an era of normal human mortality. The Sumerians wrote this pattern down first. The Hebrew scribes adopted it, modified the names and the theology, and created the framework that would become Genesis 5 through 11. The honest assessment of the evidence leads to an uncomfortable but unavoidable conclusion. Genesis is not the source. It is the adaptation. The Sumerians wrote the original draft. The Atrahasis is not the only Mesopotamian creation account. There is another, composed perhaps 500 years later in the city of Babylon, that provides a different but complementary version of how humans came to exist. It is called the Enuma Elish, a name that comes from its opening words, when on high. The Enuma Elish is primarily a cosmological epic. It describes the creation of the universe itself, beginning with a state of primordial chaos in which nothing had yet been named or formed. In the beginning, according to this text, there were only two vast bodies of water, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. They existed together, their waters mingling, and from this mingling, the first gods were born. The younger gods were loud and energetic. Their noise disturbed Apsu, who plotted to destroy them. But Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, discovered the plot and cast a spell that put Apsu into a deep sleep. Ea then established his dwelling upon the body of the sleeping Apsu, and it was there that his son Marduk was born. Marduk, the champion of the younger gods, who would go on to become the supreme deity of Babylon. When Tiamat learned of Apsu's fate, she was enraged. She raised an army of monsters, dragons, serpents, and chaos creatures, led by a god named Kingu, to whom she gave the Tablet of Destinies, the cosmic document that conferred supreme authority over the universe. The older gods were terrified. None of them could stand against Tiamat. None except Marduk. But Marduk demanded a price for his service. He would defeat Tiamat, but only if the assembly of the gods granted him supreme authority. They agreed. In a battle of cosmic proportions, Marduk confronted Tiamat. He trapped her in a net, filled her body with the four winds, and then sent an arrow through her that burst her heart. From her divided body, he created the heavens and the earth. Her upper half became the sky. Her lower half became the ground. Her eyes became the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then, after the cosmos had been organized, after the heavens and the earth had been established, the gods still had a problem. They were still laboring. They still needed workers. Marduk consulted with Ea. Together, they devised a plan. Kingu, the leader of the rebel army, the one who had stirred Tiamat to war, was brought before the assembly. He was found guilty. And from his essence, from his very life force, Ea created humanity. The text states it plainly. From his blood he created mankind, on whom he imposed the service of the gods and set the gods free. Once again, humanity is created from divine material to perform labor for the gods. The mechanism is the same as in the Atrahasis. A god is sacrificed, and from that god's essence, humanity is formed. The theological framework is the same. We exist to serve. We carry divine substance within us. We are the solution to a divine labor dispute. But there is an added dimension in the Enuma Elish. Kingu was a guilty god, a rebel, an instigator of cosmic war, and his guilt, his rebellious nature, was part of what was transmitted into humanity. This is a remarkably dark philosophical statement. It suggests that the Babylonians believed there was something inherently defiant within human nature, something that came not from the earth, but from the divine criminal whose punishment gave us life. Some scholars have drawn a connection between this concept and the Christian doctrine of original sin. In Christianity, all humans are born carrying the stain of Adam's disobedience. In the Babylonian version, all humans are born carrying the guilt of King U's rebellion. The mechanism is different, the theology is vastly different, but the underlying idea is strikingly similar. Humanity is born flawed because its origin was tainted. The Enuma Elish was composed centuries before Genesis. Its cosmological elements, the primordial waters, the separation of heaven and earth, the naming of creation, the ordering of the cosmos, all of these appear, transformed and streamlined, in Genesis 1. The biblical Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters echoes the primordial Apsu and Tiamat, the separation of the waters above from the waters below, mirrors Marduk's division of Tiamat's body. The sequential, ordered nature of creation in Genesis 1, light, sky, land, vegetation, celestial bodies, animals, humanity, follows a logic that was first articulated in Mesopotamian cosmological thought. The parallels are not perfect. Genesis strips away the violence, the divine conflict, the polytheism. It replaces the chaotic battle between cosmic forces with the serene, authoritative word of a single God. But the bones of the story, the architecture, the sequence, the concept of creation from pre-existing material, of humanity as the final act, these belong to Mesopotamia first. Perhaps the most revealing detail of all is hidden in plain sight: the word Eden. For centuries, English-speaking readers have assumed that Eden is a Hebrew word, perhaps meaning delight or pleasure, and there is a Hebrew root, dn, that can carry those connotations. But there is another possibility, one that most scholars of ancient Near Eastern languages consider far more likely. In Sumerian, the word Edin means steppe or plain. It refers to the flat, uncultivated land between the cities of Mesopotamia, the open terrain where shepherds grazed their flocks and where wild animals roamed. It was not a garden. It was the opposite of a garden. It was the wild, untamed land that surrounded the carefully irrigated and cultivated urban centers of Sumerian civilization. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the central characters is Enkidu, a wild man who lives in the Edin, the steppe, among the animals. He is naked, uncivilized, innocent. He drinks water with the gazelles. He does not know shame. And then a woman is sent to him, a temple priestess, who introduces him to the knowledge of civilization. After their encounter, Enkidu finds that the animals flee from him. He has changed. He has gained awareness. He has lost his innocence. This narrative, a naked innocent living in a natural paradise, encountering a woman who introduces knowledge and causes a permanent separation from the animal world, is the story of Adam and Eve. It is the same structure, the same themes, the same progression, from innocence to awareness to exile, and it takes place in the Edin. The word traveled, the concept traveled, and by the time the Hebrew scribes composed Genesis, the Sumerian Eden had been transformed into the Hebrew Eden. The steppe of Mesopotamia had become the garden of God, but the underlying narrative remained recognizable: a place of innocence, a moment of forbidden knowledge, an irreversible change, an exile from paradise. And there is yet another connection that anchors the Garden of Eden firmly in Mesopotamian geography. Genesis 2:10-14 describes 4 rivers that flow from Eden: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. 2 of these rivers are explicitly Mesopotamian. The Tigris and Euphrates are the defining waterways of ancient Iraq, the very rivers that the Sumerian creation myths describe the gods as having dug and maintained. The Garden of Eden, according to Genesis itself, is located in Mesopotamia. It is not in heaven. It is not in some transcendent spiritual realm. It is in Iraq, between the rivers that the Sumerians considered sacred. The text is telling us where the story came from, if we are willing to listen. If this journey through the oldest stories ever written is giving you something, if it is making you think about history and origins and the deep roots of the stories we tell ourselves, consider subscribing to this channel. Every week we go back further than most people are willing to look, into the clay and the dust and the cuneiform inscriptions that hold the earliest thoughts humanity ever preserved. Your subscription helps us continue this work, and it means that the next time we uncover something extraordinary from the ancient world, you will be the first to hear about it. There is a historical moment that makes the transmission of Mesopotamian creation narratives into Hebrew scripture not merely plausible, but almost inevitable. It is the Babylonian exile. In 586 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and deported a significant portion of the Jewish population to Babylon. For approximately 50 years, the Jewish intellectual and priestly elite lived in the heart of Mesopotamia, in the very cities where the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, and the Epic of Gilgamesh were still being copied, studied, and recited. This was not a peripheral encounter. The Jewish exiles were not confined to isolated camps on the outskirts of the empire. Many of them integrated into Babylonian society. They learned the language. They worked in the administration. They had access to the libraries, the temples, the scribal schools, where cuneiform tablets were meticulously preserved and studied. It was during this period that many scholars believe the Hebrew Bible underwent its most significant editorial phase. The texts that would become Genesis, Exodus, and the other books of the Torah were compiled, organized, and in many cases rewritten by priestly editors working in Babylon. These editors, known in biblical scholarship as the P-source, or the priestly source, were responsible for giving Genesis its current shape. And they were working in a city that was saturated with Mesopotamian mythology. The Enuma Elish was publicly recited during the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu. The Epic of Gilgamesh was one of the most widely copied texts in the ancient world. The creation and flood narratives were not obscure scholarly curiosities. They were the foundational stories of Babylonian culture, as pervasive as the Bible is in the Western world today. The Jewish scribes did not simply copy these stories, they transformed them. And the transformation revealed something profound about the theological project of the Hebrew Bible. The Mesopotamian creation stories were polytheistic. They depicted gods who were petty, jealous, frightened of their own creations. They portrayed humanity as a labor force, created to serve divine beings who could barely govern themselves. The cosmos was chaotic, governed by conflict and compromise. The Hebrew authors took this raw material and distilled it into something radically different. They collapsed the pantheon into a single god. They replaced divine conflict with divine authority. They elevated humanity from servant to image-bearer. They replaced the cosmic chaos of Tiamat with the ordered, purposeful word of a sovereign creator. This was not plagiarism. It was theological revolution. The Hebrew scribes looked at the Mesopotamian stories and said, in effect, "Your gods are flawed. Your cosmos is chaotic. Your view of humanity is demeaning. Here is a better story. Here is a story in which one God, just and powerful and purposeful, creates the world not out of conflict, but out of intention. Here is a story in which humanity is not a servant class, but the crown of creation, made in the divine image." But the revolution depended on the original. Without the Atrahasis, there is no Genesis. Without the Enuma Elish, there is no in the beginning. Without the Mesopotamian flood narrative, there is no Noah. The Hebrew Bible is not independent of its Mesopotamian roots. It is a response to them. A brilliant, theologically sophisticated, morally elevated response, but a response nonetheless. And the Sumerian tablets, sitting in their museum cases, remind us that there was something before the response. Something older, something that preceded the beginning. One of the most peculiar features of Genesis is its list of patriarchs who live for extraordinary lengths of time. Adam lives 930 years. Methuselah reaches 969. Noah survives to 950. These numbers have baffled readers for millennia. Are they literal, symbolic, corrupted by textual transmission? The Sumerian king list provides context that makes these numbers less mysterious, though perhaps more troubling. The king list records the rulers of Sumerian cities from the dawn of civilization through the historical period. And the antediluvian kings, those who ruled before the flood, have reigns that make the biblical patriarchs look positively short-lived. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. Al-Aljar, also of Eridu, reigned for 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira reigned for 43,200 years. The total reign of the 8 antediluvian kings, according to the king list, spans 241,200 years. After the flood, the reigns drop dramatically. The first post-diluvian king of Kish reigned for 1,200 years. Within a few generations, the numbers fall to hundreds, then to decades, approaching normal human lifespans. The pattern is identical to Genesis. Before the flood, lifespans are enormous. After the flood, they decline rapidly. The flood serves as the dividing line between an age of extraordinary longevity and the age of normal human mortality. Many scholars have noted that the Sumerian numbers follow a mathematical pattern based on the sexagesimal system, the base 60 number system that the Sumerians invented and that we still use today for measuring time and angles. The specific figures are multiples and combinations of the sacred numbers 60 and 3,600, which is 60 squared. This suggests that the numbers are symbolic rather than literal, expressions of the immense antiquity and importance of the antediluvian period, rather than actual biographical data. The same may be true of the Genesis patriarchs. Their ages may not be intended as literal counts of solar years, but as symbolic expressions of their significance in the cosmic timeline, adapted from the Sumerian mathematical tradition, but scaled down to fit the more modest framework of Hebrew chronology. What matters is not the specific numbers, but the shared structure. Both traditions preserve the memory of a time before the flood, when things were different, when humans, or rulers, or both, existed on a different scale. Both traditions mark the flood as the Great Reset, the event that ended one era and began another. And both traditions locate the origin of this understanding in Mesopotamia, in the land between two rivers, where civilization began and where the first stories were told. There is a theme that appears in several Mesopotamian creation texts that adds a fascinating layer to our understanding. In some accounts, the creation of humanity was not a single, successful act. It was a process that involved multiple attempts, failures, and revisions. In certain Sumerian texts, Enki and Nintu do not immediately produce the perfect human worker. Their first attempts are flawed. They create beings that are incomplete, damaged, incapable of fulfilling their intended purpose. One version describes a being who cannot bend its hands or grasp objects. Another describes a creature that cannot control its body. A third describes a being who is blind or otherwise impaired. Nintu and Enki do not discard these flawed creations. Instead, they assign them roles within society, finding functions that their limitations can accommodate. But the failures teach them, and they refine their process until they produce a viable, functional human being. This theme of divine trial and error, of imperfect prototypes preceding the final version, appears in other ancient traditions as well. The Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Maya, describes the gods creating humanity 3 times. The first attempt from mud, dissolved in water. The second from wood, produced beings without souls who were destroyed by a flood. Only the third attempt from maize succeeded. In Genesis, there are 2 creation accounts. Genesis 1 describes a 6-day creation in which humanity is created on the 6th day, male and female together, as the culmination of the process. Genesis 2 tells a different story. God forms Adam from dust, places him in a garden, and only later creates Eve from Adam's rib. Biblical scholars have long recognized these as 2 distinct traditions that were combined by later editors. The discrepancies between them, the different order of creation, the different methods, the different relationship between male and female, suggest that they originated as separate accounts. Could these 2 Genesis accounts be distant echoes of the Mesopotamian tradition of multiple creation attempts? It is a possibility that cannot be easily dismissed. If the Hebrew editors were working with Mesopotamian source material, they may have inherited multiple versions of the creation narrative, each reflecting a different stage or emphasis in the original tradition, and woven them together as best they could. The Sumerians were comfortable with the idea that creation was not a single, perfect act, but a process of learning and refinement. Their gods were not omniscient. They made mistakes. They improved. They iterated. This is a remarkably modern way of thinking about the emergence of complex systems, and it stands in sharp contrast to the Genesis model of instantaneous, perfect creation by an all-knowing deity. But the older model, the Sumerian model of trial and error, may be closer to the truth. Not because the gods literally experimented with clay, but because the natural process of evolution, which we now understand as the actual mechanism by which complex life arose, is itself a process of trial and error, of mutations that fail, of adaptations that succeed, of endless iteration, spanning not thousands, but billions of years. The Sumerians intuited something that modern science would later confirm. Complexity does not spring into existence fully formed. It emerges through a long, imperfect, sometimes painful process of development. Their gods struggled to create us. Nature struggled to create us. In both stories, the result was the same: a flawed but remarkable being, standing at the intersection of the mundane and the miraculous. Step back now from the details, the specific names and dates and parallel texts, and consider what the Sumerian creation story tells us about the people who wrote it. The Sumerians lived in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. Southern Mesopotamia was flat, hot, dry, and prone to devastating floods. The only way to make it habitable was through massive collective labor, digging canals, building levees, irrigating fields, draining marshes. Every aspect of Sumerian civilization depended on this constant, backbreaking effort. When they asked the fundamental human question, "Why are we here?" They looked at their own lives and gave the most honest answer they could. We are here to work. We exist because someone, something, needed the work done. Our bodies are made of earth because we are tied to the earth. Our minds contain a spark of something greater because we are capable of more than mere labor. This is not a hopeful origin story. It does not promise redemption or divine love or eternal life in a paradise beyond the stars. It says, you were made to serve, and you will grow old serving, and then you will return to the clay from which you were formed. But within this stark framework, there is also a quiet dignity. The Sumerians knew that even though they were servants with divine intelligence. They could build, they could write, they could compose music and poetry. They could look at the stars and calculate their movements. They could, in the privacy of their own minds, think thoughts as vast and complex as anything the gods could conceive. The Sumerian creation story is a mirror. It reflects the people who wrote it, their labor, their resignation, their quiet pride, their hunger for meaning in a world that seemed to demand everything and offer little in return. And in this, it reflects us as well, because we have never stopped asking the same question. Why are we here? What is the purpose of a life that begins in helplessness, fills itself with labor, and ends in silence? The Sumerians gave one answer. The Hebrew scribes, working with the same raw material, gave another. They said, you are not merely servants. You are images of God. You are loved. You matter not because of what you can do, but because of what you are. This is the theological leap that separates Genesis from the Atrahasis. It is genuine and it is profound. But it is also a response. It is a rewriting. It is a correction of what the Hebrew scribes perceived as a deficiency in the older story. And the older story, the original draft, is still there, still readable, still waiting in its clay tablets for anyone who wants to understand not just what we were told about our origins, but what was told first. According to the Sumerian tradition, the first city ever built was Eridu. It was located in the extreme south of Mesopotamia, near the edge of the marshlands, where the Euphrates emptied into the sea. Today, the site lies in the desert of southern Iraq, miles from the nearest major waterway. But 5,000 years ago, it was at the edge of the world, the point where dry land met the waters of the Gulf, the threshold between the human and the divine. Eridu was sacred to Enki. It was the site of his temple, the Ihabzu, the house of the freshwater deep. The Sumerians believed that beneath Eridu lay the Abzu, the vast underground ocean of sweet water that was the source of all rivers and springs. Enki dwelt in this subterranean realm, and his temple was the point of connection between his watery domain and the surface world where humans lived. The archaeological remains at Eridu tell a remarkable story. Excavations in the 1940s revealed a sequence of temple structures built one on top of another, spanning millennia. The earliest levels date to around 5,400 BC, making Eridu one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in the world. The very first temple was tiny, barely a small room with an altar and evidence of fish offerings. But each successive rebuilding was larger, more elaborate, more architecturally sophisticated, until the final ziggurat stood as one of the great monuments of Sumerian civilization. Fish offerings. This detail is significant. Enki was associated with water, with fish, with the deep. The earliest inhabitants of Eridu were bringing fish to the altar of a deity who, thousands of years later, would be described in the fully developed Sumerian mythology as the creator of humanity, the lord of the underground waters, the god who spoke to a reed wall to save the human race from a flood. The continuity is staggering. From the tiny mud brick shrine of 5400 BC to the great ziggurat of the 3rd millennium, the people of Eridu were worshipping the same god in the same place for nearly 3,000 years, and the story they told about this god, the story of Enki creating humanity from clay and divine essence, the story of Enki saving humanity from the flood, the story of Enki granting wisdom and then withholding immortality. This was the story that would eventually, through centuries of transmission and transformation, become the Book of Genesis. Eridu is not just the first city, it is the first chapter, the place where the story began, the place where someone first pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded the belief that humanity was created by beings greater than itself, for a purpose that may not have been entirely noble, but with materials that gave us something extraordinary, the capacity to wonder why we exist. In Genesis, the serpent is the villain. It tempts Eve. It introduces doubt. It subverts the command of God. For thousands of years, Christian and Jewish tradition has interpreted the serpent as an agent of evil, sometimes identified with Satan, the adversary of God and humanity. But in Mesopotamian iconography and mythology, the serpent is not evil. It is the symbol of Enki. The association between Enki and the serpent runs deep in Sumerian culture. One of the most famous cylinder seals from ancient Mesopotamia, known informally as the Temptation Seal and housed in the British Museum, depicts two figures seated on either side of a tree, with a serpent behind one of them. The composition is strikingly reminiscent of the Genesis garden scene. But in the Mesopotamian context, the serpent is not a tempter. It is a symbol of wisdom, of healing, of the underground waters over which Enki presides. Enki's symbol was two serpents intertwined around a staff, a motif that survived into Greek mythology as the caduceus of Hermes, and that survives today as the symbol of medicine. The serpent represented knowledge, regeneration, the cyclical nature of life. It shed its skin and was reborn. It lived in the earth, close to the underground waters. It was Enki's creature. Now reconsider the Genesis narrative with this context in mind. A serpent, associated in the original tradition with the god of wisdom and the creator of humanity, tells the first woman to eat from the tree of knowledge. The woman eats. She gains awareness. And the supreme deity, whose role in the original tradition was played by the authoritarian Enlil, punishes both the serpent and the humans. In the Sumerian framework, this is not a story about evil tempting innocence. It is a story about the conflict between two gods, one who wants humanity to have knowledge, and one who wants humanity to remain ignorant and obedient. The serpent of Genesis is the last surviving trace of Enki in the Hebrew narrative. Stripped of his name, reduced to an animal, recast as an adversary, Enki still appears in Genesis as the voice that says, "Eat the fruit, gain the knowledge, become wise." The Hebrew authors transformed the serpent from a divine ally into a cosmic villain. In doing so, they resolved the theological problem of having two gods with competing agendas. There could only be one God, and that God could not be simultaneously the giver of knowledge and the punisher of knowledge. So the giver was demoted to a serpent, and the punisher was elevated to the one true God. But the original story, the Sumerian story, preserved a more complex and perhaps more truthful understanding of the human condition. We are pulled in two directions. We hunger for knowledge, for understanding, for the wisdom that makes us more than animals. And we are punished for that hunger, constrained by mortality, by suffering, by the limitations of our bodies and our societies. The Sumerians encoded this tension in their myths. Enki and Enlil, wisdom and authority, the serpent and the storm. Genesis inherited the tension, but erased its source. And in doing so, it created a mystery, the mystery of the serpent, that has puzzled readers for thousands of years. The answer to that mystery lies in Mesopotamia. There are, at this moment, approximately 500,000 cuneiform tablets sitting in museums, universities, and private collections around the world. Of these, only a fraction have been fully translated. The British Museum alone holds more than 130,000 tablets, many of which have never been read by a modern scholar. They sit in storage, catalogued but untranslated, waiting for the specialists and the funding that would allow their contents to be revealed. Every year, new translations are published. Every year, scholars read tablets that no one has read for 3,000 years and discover something that reshapes our understanding of the ancient world. A medical text, a legal code, a poem, a letter from a soldier to his wife, a prayer from a mother for her sick child. A creation myth that fills in a gap in our knowledge of how the Sumerians imagined their place in the cosmos. The vast majority of what the Sumerians wrote is still unread. We are working with a fraction of the evidence. The story we have reconstructed tonight, the creation of humanity, the flood, the garden, the serpent, all of this comes from tablets that were deciphered over the past century and a half. But there are thousands more waiting. What else did the Sumerians know? What other stories did they tell? What details of the creation narrative are sitting right now in a museum drawer, pressed into clay by a hand that has been dust for 4,000 years, waiting for someone to pick it up and read it? The tablets are patient. They have waited millennia. They can wait a little longer. But the knowledge they contain, the oldest written thoughts in human history, deserves to be heard. Not because it replaces what we believe, but because it deepens it. Because it reminds us that the questions we ask, who made us? Why are we here? What happens when we reach for forbidden knowledge? Are not modern questions. They are the oldest questions, and the first answers were written not in the language of prophets and apostles, but in the wedge-shaped marks of Sumerian scribes who lived when the world was young. Before we begin to close this chapter, I would like to hear from you. What other ancient mystery would you like to explore in the next episode? Would you like to go deeper into the Epic of Gilgamesh and the search for immortality? Or perhaps into the lost civilization that may have built Göbekli Tepe 7,000 years before the Sumerians? Or maybe the true origins of the Egyptian pyramids, and why their construction techniques mirror those of cultures on the other side of the world. Your suggestions guide our journey, so leave your ideas in the comments below. The next story we tell could be yours. We have followed a thread tonight that stretches from the British Museum in Victorian London to the marshlands of southern Iraq, from the reed walls of Atra Hassis's house to the garden that the Sumerians called Dilmun, from the clay workshop of Enki and Nintu to the opening verses of the book of Genesis. and the thread has led us to a conclusion that is both unsettling and illuminating. Genesis is not the beginning, it is the inheritor, the story of humanity's creation, the shaping of the first being from earth and divine essence, the placement in a garden, the encounter with forbidden knowledge, the loss of immortality, the flood that nearly ended everything. All of these elements existed in written form at least 1,000 years before the earliest possible date for the composition of Genesis. They were inscribed on clay tablets in Sumerian and Akkadian, stored in temple libraries, recited during festivals, taught to scribal students, and transmitted across generations and across cultures until they reached the Hebrew scribes, who gave them their final, most famous form. This does not diminish Genesis. If anything, it enriches it. Because Genesis is not merely a story, it is a response. It is a theological argument made in conversation with a much older tradition. The Hebrew authors looked at the Mesopotamian creation narrative, with its quarreling gods and its expendable humans and its cynical view of the human condition, and they said, "We can do better. We can tell a story in which humanity is not a servant class, but the image of the divine. We can tell a story in which the Creator is not tired or frustrated, but purposeful and good. We can tell a story in which meaning is not imposed by indifferent gods, but gifted by a loving one." That is the achievement of Genesis. Not that it invented the creation narrative, but that it transformed it. It took the raw clay of Mesopotamian mythology and reshaped it into something that millions of people, for thousands of years, have found worthy of building their lives around. But the clay came from Sumer. The first hands that shaped it belonged to scribes who lived in Eridu and Ur and Uruk and Nippur. And the story they told, the story of Enki and Enlil, of Nintu and Atrahasis, of the Lulu created from divine blood and earthly clay. This story is older than any Bible, older than any church, older than any synagogue or mosque. It is the first story, the one that came before Genesis, the one that came before the beginning. The Tigris and the Euphrates still flow through Iraq. They are shallower now, their courses altered by dams and irrigation projects. The land between them, once the most fertile on earth, is drier than it was 5,000 years ago. The cities of Sumer lie beneath mounds of earth and sand, visited occasionally by archaeologists and disturbed only by the wind. But the clay tablets endure, fired by accident or design, hardened by the same sun that baked the Mesopotamian plains. They have survived everything that destroyed the civilizations that created them. Wars, conquests, empires rising and falling, libraries burning, languages dying, religions being born and being forgotten. The tablets survived it all. They are among the most durable objects ever created by human hands, and they carry within them the oldest stories our species ever wrote down. In a quiet room in a museum somewhere, a curator opens a drawer. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lies a tablet no larger than a hand. Its surface is covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks. It has not been fully translated. It may contain a tax receipt, it may contain a shopping list, or it may contain a fragment of the creation story, a verse that fills in a gap we did not know existed, a detail that changes everything. The curator picks it up. The clay is cool. The marks catch the light. And for a moment, across 5,000 years, two hands are connected. The hand that holds the tablet now, and the hand that shaped it then. Both human, both made of the same elements, both carrying somewhere deep within their cells the same inheritance of wonder that made one person press marks into clay and another person try to read them. The Sumerians said we were made from the earth and the divine. Science says we are made from carbon and stardust. The language is different. The meaning is the same. We are part of the ground we walk on, and we are part of something larger, something that has been asking the same question since the very first mind opened its eyes and looked at the sky and wondered, who made us? The Sumerians had an answer. The Hebrews had an answer. We are still looking for ours. But tonight, at least, we know that the search is older than we thought. It did not begin with Genesis. It began with a stylus and a piece of wet clay in a land between two rivers, in a city called Eridu, at the edge of the world. And the tablets are still speaking to anyone who is willing to listen. The night grows quiet now. The ancient words settle like sediment in still water. The gods of Sumer have long since fallen silent. Their temples are dust. Their cities are buried. But the story they told, the first story, the story that came before Genesis, before the Bible, before everything we thought we knew, that story is still here, pressed into clay, waiting in the dark, as patient as the earth itself. And now, tonight, you have heard it. The distance between us and the Sumerians is measured in millennia, but the questions that separated them from their gods are the same questions that separate us from our own understanding of the universe. Why do we exist? What is consciousness? Why do we long for things we cannot have? For immortality, for certainty, for a meaning that would make sense of everything. The Sumerians did not have answers. They had stories, and those stories, imperfect and incomplete, carried within them a truth that transcends theology and doctrine. We are made of the earth and something more. We are bound by mortality and yet capable of touching the infinite. We are, in the words pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, the mixed ones, part dust, part divinity, walking between worlds. That is the legacy of the tablets. That is the message written before Genesis. And it is enough to carry us through the night, into whatever morning waits on the other side of these ancient dreams.